If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have Jeremy Rothe-Kushel and Greg McCarron on the show. They're the co-hosts to The Antedote, a podcast that's regularly carried on YouTube. Jeremy and Greg, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well, Tim. Thank you for having us on.
Well, thank you for coming on. So, how do you want to kick this off? Well, you've done a number of shows where you've covered issues like false opposition, controlled opposition. You brought up this idea of gangs and counter-gangs, which was sort of a British strategy. I think Major Kitson did it as sort of a counterinsurgency operation. The British attempted to preserve their decaying empire in the 20th century. This brings up issues like George Soros and John Birch Society, the alt-right. So how do you want to address this issue?
Yeah, so in a certain way, you could see that there's three different levels to the idea of the creation of false narratives, false groups. And in a way, the idea of deception is as ancient a technique in terms of all kinds of military affairs as you can imagine, all the way back to Sun Tzu and probably before that. And so, in a way, you can imagine that if one were a desire to be conquering force of some sort, then of course the ancient tradition is divide and conquer, and so you can set up a false idea or a false narrative or a false concept in a way, so a counter gang concept. Many people would probably recognize aspects of historical narratives or certain types of philosophies or techno-scientific so-called consensuses as that kind of idea of falsely constructed counter narrative or counter concepts. But then you also have the idea of the one-off event, the incident, which is most well known as the false flag. Maybe in the 21st century, we might have to update it. There's always this idea of the planted passport or the fake patch operation, but an idea of where there is an entire operation in some way is a constructed singular narrative or an incident, a constructed incident. But then you can also have something such as a counter gang or a counter person, even a counter actor, a counter character, maybe we could call them. The idea of I know that Joe Atwill has come up with this concept of the lifetime actor. So you could imagine that if there are such things as intelligence agencies that raise people up and train them to be political actors of sorts, then there are also such things as many actors getting together in a troupe or a gang, an acting gang that has been largely constructed for reasons of deception.
Yes, I think people who are familiar with the intelligence game or tradecraft are familiar with the terms like sheep dipping. You know, you can have the agency will have a method to infiltrate other bureaucracies or even corporations and Hollywood, and also when we're talking about Central Intelligence Agency or the intelligence community in general. It isn't really separate than, say, from the corporate or banking interest that created it. So often it's a question of semantics. We're talking about operatives in Hollywood, or working with the agency, working with the Pentagon to create certain memes or to promote certain cultural ideas, certain narratives in movies. I mean, I think we're familiar with Arnold Milchan and his role in Hollywood. Advancing the interest of a certain interest in these things. So this isn't something that any informed person should think is beyond the pale or beyond the realm of possibility. It's just you think this type of thing is inevitable if you're running a global empire and trying to practice what they call full spectrum dominance.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because when you look at history, especially modern history, when you look over the course of, say, the past, I don't know, anywhere from past 80 to 100 years at least, and then I'm sure beyond that, these same patterns continue to pop up constantly, where you have these same patterns of all these people who reach certain levels coming from the same backgrounds, the same institutions, the same education, the same type of institutions and same type of it's just very similar backgrounds all around. And when you look at the levers of power, when you look in the areas of what you might call controlled opposition, or people who have prominent platforms within what would widely be considered to be alternative media or anti-establishment type think tanks or institutions or outlets, very much you look at these people's backgrounds, and there's always these connections there, there always seem to be these connections which will tie them to either some type of intelligence agency or some type of government agency or think tank, NGO, or whatnot. And it continuously pops up throughout history. This has been very thoroughly documented by people who have taken the time to research and understand it.
Yeah, I mean, outfits like the USA Aid, which isn't supposed to be an intelligence operation or a black op operation, but we know it most certainly is. Or what's the National Endowment for Democracy. Or
the National Endowment for the Arts, one might even assume,
or the modern art, the Modern Art Museum of New York, or something.
Right, or modern art as a concept.
Yeah, it's a concept correctly. Yeah. And so again, it gets back to like full spectrum dominance. Controlling the culture is obviously probably more important than at least as important as, say, controlling the banking system, because they both obviously enable each other.
Yes, and you bring up a good point too, because we can not only have a counter gang or an actor of some sort, but you could like you've talked about the idea of USAID, which is supposedly an aid operation from the U.S. government, but in large part it's a CIA sheep-dipped as an aid operation. Mm-hmm. And you can also then imagine, like you brought up earlier, the idea of the corporate sector, and where does the full spectrum dominance that is desired end? And so we could even think through things like institutions such as Google or Facebook in a way. I was thinking earlier today about in the wake of September 11th, I think it was maybe John Poindexter who had floated the idea of the Total Information Awareness program or agency, and I think it was even it had the all-seeing eye on top of a pyramid floated as its moniker and icon, and it was pretty quickly shut down as a little bit too frontal an assault maybe. But then what you see is very soon thereafter you have Facebook pop up. It sort of becomes an opt-in total information awareness institution of some sort. It finances itself to some extent. And in a way, rather than trying to collect against people's wills or unknowingly collect information about in large data sets about their political interests, their psychologies, their cultural beliefs, that type of thing. You have people who are running to join up and start their own profile so that they can find all of their old friends from high school in a way and start clicking on what they're interested in. And then, of course, we know that In-Q-Tel and likely very other intelligence agencies, probably most intensely nowadays centered in Tel Aviv, are very, very much involved in the data collection and the back-end technology that Facebook actually represents. And now it's not even just America. John Poindexter was thinking too small in a way. Now Facebook has total information awareness of 2 billion people on the entire planet in a way. And if you take things like Cambridge Analytica as very seriously, then the psychographical data that's available, they claim that they have thousands of data points on almost most of the individuals in the United States of America. And so in a certain way, you could then say that Facebook in many ways is a counter, an institutional counter gang of what total information awareness was always hoped to be.
Yes. I mean, I remember a few years ago it was The Onion, the satire news site, had a fake report about Facebook. They had people from the CIA and NSA talking about Facebook, how it saved them billions of dollars in intelligence gathering, and all these people are just showing up and providing all this information for them for free, and they love it. And
I remember that.
Yeah, sometimes The Onion is very, very honest in its satire.
Yes. Well, that's satire is often the most honest way to. Is the only way you can tell the truth without getting killed, I think.
It's the way that you can do it without getting in trouble or get killed. It's true.
But yeah, I mean that's all this intelligence. Same thing with the development of club cards offering discounts to regular shoppers, and these things are ways of tracking one's purchases and all that. It's this big data, and same thing. All these various conveniences and supposed security devices. Look at the cloud, right? The whole cloud storage idea.
Yes, and so like any instant where you can take advantage of somebody's desire to get a better price in terms of you're talking about club cards, that type of thing, you can get a little discount, or the efficiencies or conveniences that are represented by things like Google, Gmail, Facebook, Amazon. These types of things are potent places to entice people to give up their data set to the cloud, the all-knowing cloud up above, and more so. And I mean, because of course the idea of the counter gang existed before there was, definitely before there was printing. Who knows? Maybe it probably existed even before there was a written word. But in the day and age of digital technology, there is a ton of weight given to the idea of graphs. And Google you can think of as the information graph, and thinking about that Google Maps came out of a Keyhole, I believe it was. It was being developed for the I don't think the National Reconnaissance Office, but the National Geospatial Agency, I believe, and then that gets turned into Google Maps, and we the people then have access to this incredible technology. It probably didn't even exist at the highest levels of the military, 50 years ago potentially. But what are we trading in relationship to that? So in thinking through these graphs, the Google information, not only collecting a data set of the individual's interests, but they're also collecting a data set of the different collective data sets. And Facebook, of course, is the idea of the social graph. Who are you connected to? Who are you friends? How do you respond to what your friend posts? And then maybe we could see something like Amazon as a thing graph. There's a lot of talk of the Internet of Things. And of course, Amazon is the key locus for acquiring things with a click of a button, and of course they've moved beyond just the thing graph and moved into, of course, being a major host of CIA servers in terms of their Amazon Web Services. Bezos buying the Washington Post, so that sounds like the acquisition of media branding of some sort. But also the increasing production of entertainment and movies and these types of things all across the board. And so all of these different graphs and the corporate sectors that are very much tied into all kinds of deep state sets represent some of the most intensely focused places of deception and the creation of false flag narratives and countergangs.
And an example of, say, a false or controlled opposition might be something like, Silicon Valley and the development of the personal computer, where it's been attributed to sort of this hippie generation, freewheeling, sort of liberal.
LSD.
LSD, Stuart Brandt. But if you look at characters like Stuart Brandt, they have connections go right back to the Pentagon intelligence community, right? I mean, so...
I believe Stuart Brandt is U.S. Army, maybe intelligence.
Yeah. So, and, so the whole web, of course, they call it the web, which is interesting because when you see a web, there's usually a spider somewhere. So,
Yeah. Jeremy mentioned. I just had to bring this up because we're talking about on the domestic level how these major tech companies operate. But Jeremy did mention false flags just now, and I have to say that Google very much has played a leading role in a lot of the propaganda we've known about foreign policy as well, because it was Google Earth which came out with the alleged images of the North Korean concentration death camps that were all over the media a few years ago. So,
that's that. Good point. It's a very good point.
Yes, and also Google was apparently a Google employee played a key role in some of the aspects of the Arab Spring and in the Egyptian uprising, but also this idea of the formerly known Google Ideas Group, started by a combination of Jared Cohen and Eric Schmidt, I believe the former CEO of Google. And Jared Cohen worked in the State Department, worked close to Condoleezza Rice. And Google Ideas is apparently become Google Jigsaw, and is apparently operating all around the planet with not only ideas at this point. It could be called Google Special Forces, maybe. So when you begin to put together the idea of massive data, way beyond big data, we're talking about mega data now, in combination with the ability to hire contractors, special forces contractors, then there's plus not having the problems of a constitution or an oath to a constitution to try to sidestep, as Kissinger said, the unconstitutional takes a little bit longer. Then you can imagine that the deep corporate sector is the perfect locus from which to run all kinds of information-driven psychological operations that actually have a terrorist component to them.
Yeah, like individual or human targeting or something. Targeted individuals. This harassment where you can, what these Germans call disintegration. You can destroy their lives gradually if they're a whistleblower or a troublemaker. You mentioned the private military contractor. I just happened to read an article this morning about this, and in the article it cited estimated $150 billion. $150 billion is the budget for all the private military contractors around the world. Of course, that's primarily Anglo-American and Israeli. That exceeds the military budgets of most countries. And I think that they estimate like 45,000 private military contractors with no oversight. Now, obviously, the oversight on Pentagon is largely theoretical. Same with the oversight over the intelligence community. It's a joke. But there isn't even a pretext of oversight over these private corporations that are pretty much, these are mercenary forces that are active not just abroad fighting dirty wars, but I suspect right here at home. So
I would imagine, and in a certain way, I would assert that this is a deeply structural, even philosophical conundrum that we've created. And I have a single concept that I've contributed to political philosophy, and it's the idea of a hierarchy of sovereignty. And the way that I believe it should be structured is where you have at the top you have the idea of the commons, which is you could consider the natural rights of the many. And in a way, you can imagine that biological life and human life has to have a certain integrity and maybe sanctity of the natural commons in order to even exist, such as clean water, clean air, food, these types of things. And then underneath that, you would then have the idea of the private, which is really the natural rights of the individual. And it's the idea of the natural rights of the individual human or even the individual organism to protect themselves. This is where we also have the best of the Bill of Rights and the protection of our individual rights, our rights within our own homes and our home as our castle. Mm-hmm. And then underneath that, then a certain amount of sovereignty is then delegated by we the people or we the individuals to the public sector, which you could consider the legal rights of the many, where you could sort of see the negotiations of certain aspects of the individuals in relationship to the commons. And then finally, underneath all of that, you would have the corporate sector, where a certain amount of sovereignty is then delegated down from the public sector. And we know that this is literally the case legally, that corporate charters are done by states, literal states in the United States of America. That, of course, is the famous Delaware example. If anyone who wants to create a big corporation that's going to have mega Wall Street investments, going to have to create a Delaware corporation.
Yeah,
but that means really delegated. It's a lower sector than the public state sector. In many ways, there's the sector of the natural, of the organism with pumping blood and breathing lungs, with the corporate sector, which is a fictional legalistic sector that is allows individuals to protect their natural right fashion. And so in a certain way, I think we have really a large project of rectification to do that take major overhaul of our political philosophical understanding.
Yeah. We somehow reestablished the balance between the one and the many, and obviously the individual rights are being assaulted every day. That's the sort of this desecration or destruction of the Bill of Rights in the name of national security and these things. There always seems to be the excuse. Okay, we're back. Lost connection. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. Let's see. Where were we?
Oh, I just wanted to add that maybe the issue is that this entire idea of a proper hierarchy of sovereignty that respects the natural and the individual over the legalistic and the corporate has basically just been turned completely upside down, and we have an oligarchical corporate structure that works down through completely captured governments that then dominate private individuals, that then destroy the commons of all sort, which would also include the invisible natural commons that are things like traditions, culture, language, thought, these types of things.
Yeah, this is the globalist monoculture that they want to impose on everybody.
Yes, exactly.
In the name of diversity.
Isn't that a bitch?
It's Masonic.
Black and white.
So, okay. Well, recently you've done talks about sort of this, let's apply this, what we're talking about here. You've applied, you did a recent show on sort of this conspiracy culture. And also, I guess, this conspiracy culture and also control opposition groups. What's your take on conspiracy culture? Obviously, you and I and Greg are, we're into looking into political conspiracies, because there are tons of conspiracies out there. That's politics and that's history. So when you talk about conspiracy culture, what were you focusing on there?
For me personally, it was I'm very much I believe in it. Think that it's very. I think when you really look at what passes for conspiracy culture, at least here in the West, it's very much, I would call it an inherently right-wing type of movement, because traditionally, most of what you would call conspiracy culture does come from I believe, a more rightward perspective of the world. I believe a more conservative, more conservative worldview is based on a belief in a higher power, as well as a belief in the importance of authority figures. And this is not a criticism of religion or believers, obviously, but when you look at a lot of the mentality that comes from what would pass for conspiracy culture, it comes from very much from the idea that because we believe in this and that we are standing up for what's right, there are always enemies that are trying to undermine what's good and what's moral and all this. And I think, and that also very easily can lead to people being led down a very false rabbit hole where any type of real rational thinking about conspiracies and thinking about the reality of a lot of what goes on in the world and false flag type events and elite institutions controlling discourse and shaping policy can easily be mired into a lot of more out there, in many cases, nonsense that just completely that takes you into a direction that leads you away from the truth action, that leads you down another rabbit hole where it really becomes very complicated, and you can be led into believing that, sent into all kinds of directions as far as your enemies and who your enemies are. And I believe in case of, say, the current movement, in a lot of ways, what we see now with Donald Trump and with this right-wing Western populism, I believe it's very much where you've had these beliefs in authority and beliefs in a higher power have been twisted in a way to actually aid the current agenda that's going on in a manner that, whereas before the elite institutions were your enemy, when it was, say, Obama, or when the left was in power, and now that the good, God-fearing, right-wing conservatives who believe in making America great again have the levers of power again, we can start to trust our government, and the enemies are the people that are opposing the good people who have retaken over the institutions of power, the levers of power. Now our intelligence agencies and our governing functions are back in the hands of good people. Now we've just got to keep the bad people, the evil ones who are trying to take from taking over again. Because the problem's not the inherent. The problem, we shouldn't inherently question institutions like the CIA or other domestic institutions. No, we just got to get them in the hands of good people. So when you have this narrative that's designed that those who are in the right are the ones who believe in the idea of structural order and authority figures and things of that nature. Therefore, when people come to power that who profess to believe in these things, then you can easily get many, many people to fall behind this, regardless of what the actual intentions are.
Well, that's the function.
That made sense.
No, that's the function of elections and electoral politics, and what Kara Quigley wrote about in Tragedy and Hope about this false left-right narrative, where every so often throw the bums out, and that's all it takes.
I will say it works the other way, though, too, because when you take a look at, say, of a more left-wing, and we talked about there are a minority of I would say maybe astute conspiracy researchers who are out there who do come from a more left-wing perspective, and that would be people like Peter Dale Scott, and Michael Parenti, and James Petrus, and Mark Crispin Miller, to name a few. I think with the left, it's more or less of a view where things are more collective and are more based in a belief in like the collective good of society and collectivism rather than the power of individualism, and therefore any type of advancement, any type of government instituted advancements in society are seen as progressive and are seen as needed for the advancement of humanity, and therefore any attempts to push back against that are the ultimate evil. And so when you have a push towards, say, globalism or a push towards mass collectivism, it's seen as backwards Bible thumpers that are trying to keep us from achieving this type of consensus. So therefore, when you have these major advancements, say in terms of global treaties or major global organizations initiatives, this is seen as the actual true advancement progression of society, and therefore this is just the way things are destined to be, and we're destined to move forward. And so therefore the real enemy in a lot of progressive circles, I think this is very much epitomized by people like Noam Chomsky, who very much poo-poo the idea of a lot of important so-called conspiracies such as September 11th, the JFK assassination, is that, see, the real enemy is not that there's an inherent system that's inherently leading us astray and is leading us down a path to destruction. No, the real problem is that the real progressive leaders in society are that they're being co-opted or whatnot. It's capitalism, it's bigotry, it's placing the importance of the individual and individual rights and sovereignty over the collective good. So I think we see the opposite in a lot of ways with the right, whereas the belief in authority, the belief of a higher power that controls things actually leads a lot of right-leaning people to having a more conspiratorial worldview in a lot of ways. With the left, I think you get a less conspiratorial worldview that may be inherent because of the belief that this is the natural progression of society to make all of these advances.
Yeah, I think it's part of a dialectic that's both sides are manipulated at various times, but it suits their purposes. It's the function of elections. You get a left, you get the reformist Barack Obama in, and what does he do? He wages wars and runs the debt up, and then you put in a conservative Donald Trump. What does he do? He wages wars and runs the debt up. And I think I think this is discussed in James Billington's Fire in the Minds of Men, where he talks about this early revolutionary ideas where the collectivist mindset and the libertarian atomist mindset has the final destination. Either way, it's a dialectic, and it's ultimately involves in sort of the reduction of humanity into just a material being. And so there's the philosophical trick there that's played. But both sides, while appear to be fighting one another, are leading humanity towards the final destination. So yeah, it's that tension between the one and the many, and both ideas I think have merit, but they can be exploited and weaponized at various times. And the oligarchs, who have the levers of the control of cultural, economic, political, military power, can very easily manipulate the masses and get us fighting, getting us looking at fighting each other instead of looking at at the people who are the elite, who are a true enemy. So
yeah, I think the culture wars has played a key role in that, where you get people, and it's not to say that there's not a culture war between right and left and moral and so-called immoral, but I think it's been manipulated to a point to where anybody who comes out with buzzwords of, say, the culture wars and of giving the guise of standing up for civilization and standing up for what's right will get. I think there's definitely a very much an inherent wanting by so many people to believe that these people who will stand up for their culture are on the side of good. So
I mean, I think you and Jeremy both talked about an example would be an outfit like InfoWars and Alex Jones, where at one time he was sort of this conspiracy theorist talking about 9/11, talking about the police state and going after these institutions, these bureaucracies as being the enemy. And then all of a sudden, he's posturing as sort of a pro-Trump, and he's adopted the sort of this idea that we have to fight Islamo-leftist or something.
Yes, the Islamo-leftist conspiracy.
Yeah, and that's he got that from what's his name, the old New Left guy, right?
David Horowitz.
David Horowitz,
which is a very important point actually, because in terms of what you brought up before about the idea of dialectics, the dualism that's created out of a much more complex, inherent, geometry, I imagine, of human life goes way beyond this or that. Up or down, left or right, and of course you also mentioned the Masonic, and of course the base, the literal base Masonic symbol is the black and white of the chessboard,
yes,
which represents the idea of you can choose one or another square. And that's obviously not an organic reality in terms of nature. Yes, there are certain aspects of it seems like, of our natural universe that have certain dualistic components, left hand, right hand in a certain way, but these are not total or totalizing. And so in a way, those that want to control will try to simplify the complexity of our reality, both external and internal, into two boxes that they can easily control. And so the reason that idea was brought up when you mentioned David Horowitz in relationship to Alex Jones is that you see this. I'm always suspicious when I see this this personal historical relationship of someone jumping from, clearly the archetype is the neoconservative starting off as left-wing revolutionary Trotskyites, and someone like David Horowitz is maybe a good example of that, or the Podoritzes, or Bill Kristol's dad, I believe, is another example of that. I'm not sure, but then they sort of flip to the other box, the other extreme, and Alex Jones seems to have done that in relationship to a sort of an extreme suspicion of public institutions and of the government and all things authority, to then being like, well, we have the white hats now in control of the authority institutions, and we need to protect it and them as much as we can. And so that is definitely something to pay attention to, is when things or ideas sort of flip in a very intense, quick, aggressive fashion. It usually brings up a lot of question marks.
Yeah. And what you have here, of course, when you have all this tension, all this suspicion and division, you have the action, and there's the reaction, and that's where the action is, really, to get that reaction that you want, so you can set yourself up as the the solution, problem, reaction, solution, which is another Masonic trick. But you've talked about the alt-right and the alt-light right they call it, or was it the light right or light alt-light or something? Alt-light. That's it. Yeah.
There's an alt-light, an alt-right, a new right, a Zionist right, a white right.
Yeah, the alt-right, initially I guess there was an umbrella where all of these people who were for Trump joined together in what's called the alt-right, but now they've got the alt-right are the people that are just more openly like critical of Jews and Jewish power and Zionism, whereas the alt-light are the ones who are like very friendly to Israel, love Israel, and are openly like in praising of Jewish people in Israel. That'd be like your Mike Cernoviches and people like that, and basically, but they both made the big ADL list, which put out all of these these names that just happen to be the ones that get the most media promotion, that are put in the big ADL list of those who are spreading hate in America. So, and they do end up at the same time. I do think they do ultimately serve the same interests. So, yeah,
because they put the worst face on perhaps which is a legitimate issue, like being concerned about Zionist or Israeli meddling or espionage, spying operations, suborning our Congress, bribery, blackmail, these things. I think, Jeremy, you've talked about the influence of Israel in the high-tech field and how they've more or less kind of been able to inveigle themselves and kind of take it over, which has serious can have serious ramifications, because the potential there for espionage, false flag, cyber war type events. They had this, this sort of what they call backdoor keys into software, into financial communications, and of course all the questions surrounding 9/11 and the Israeli involvement in that with communications. You have the Amdocs issue, which doesn't seem to get much coverage in the press. So that's an important consideration with that.
Yes, it definitely is, and Greg and I were turned on to this long-term program of Talpiot by Brendan O'Connell, the Australian activist who is actually currently in jail, apparently in New Zealand, and maybe we could touch more upon his situation a little bit later. But I do think that this idea of a long-term strategy by aspects of Israeli intelligence, technical intelligence. You brought up Arnon Milchan earlier on as an example of a counter gang member or an agent or a lifetime actor, coincidentally working in an industry of actors in terms of Hollywood, and a key nodal point in Hollywood. And of course, in terms of Israeli deep state history and claims to fame, Arnon Milchan was a key character in the Israeli intelligence division that I believe is called LAKAM, L-A-K-A-M, which is sort of economic espionage. But his specific focus, as he was also producing major films, including things like the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, but also things like Fight Club and many other movies. He was actually operating to help smuggle nuclear triggers, Krytrons, from out of Southern California, and back into Israel. And Shimon Peres, the late former prime minister of Israel, who's seen in many ways as the godfather of the Israeli nuclear weapons program, would brag that he was Arnon Milchan's handler to some extent. But of course, in an age of 21st century and an information war, an info war, it's not all about nuclear weapons and military weapons. In large part, you begin to think about things like technological backdoors, things like we were talking about before, big data, psychological warfare, psychometric warfare, psychographical warfare. And in fact, just in the last few days, I ran into this. It was a certain division of the IDF Operations Directorate that's actually titled the Center for Consciousness Operations. So isn't that interesting? We talk about PSYOPs. So if it's consciousness operation, we could talk about con ops. And isn't that a perfect way of thinking about some of these ways that the social media landscape is creating a new man or new woman in a certain way? And I brought up this idea of psychological warfare, psychographical warfare, and psychometric warfare. And in a certain way, the idea of the different deep states, and Israel obviously would have what you might term the deep Jewish state component to it. They are very much interested in the idea of rhetorical warfare, and thinking back into Aristotle's version of rhetoric and these three normally conceived categories of logos, ethos, and pathos, where logos is the idea of the power of the word and the power of logic. And of course, that's where we get psychological warfare, and warfare that's sort of coming down from on high, that's scripted, that has a certain type of language or logic to it. Sometimes it's based on the truth, and it's facts that are skewed in a certain way. You would call that gray propaganda. But sometimes it's a logic that's either illogical, or that it's based on false grammar, if you're thinking about the trivium, a false factual set that would be called black propaganda. But then you also have ethos, the second category of rhetoric, that is not necessarily related to our idea of ethics, although in a certain way I do think it comes out of that. But ethos in the ancient Greek tradition, in terms of a speaker's effectiveness or ability to reach an audience, had to do with their connection, their understanding of the culture or the society, or the understanding of the audience, the ethos of the audience, and their ability to express that. Also their background, whether they had cred in modern parlance, whether they had street cred. And in a certain way, you could then put that into the idea of psychographical warfare, which I previously described as sort of an emanation of something like social media, Facebook. So it's your social, it's your psychosocial graph, which is your community, how you like to be seen by the people that you relate with. And this, of course, relates to what we were talking about before in terms of new groupings, new alternative, alt-right ways of conceiving a political group that represents a new approach to a problem, reaction, and solution, or certain left ideologies whether it's something like, of course, like identity politics is a good example of where people want to consider the way that they're looked at. Virtue signaling, that whole idea, I think, plays into the idea of psychographical warfare. But then third and finally, there's the rhetorical category of pathos, the idea of the emotion, the appeal to emotions, and the idea of what triggers you. That probably be the modern word, triggering, right? And so then I believe that that's related to psychometric warfare. And so something looping back to Cambridge Analytica that claims that it has thousands of data points, a lot of it based on using all kinds of data points illegally, apparently, too, or against the rules in terms of Amazon Web Services, apparently, but also across Facebook and the massive corporate commercialized data points that have been developed by Facebook on their user base. You could then see that something like Cambridge Analytica has thousands of data points that not only relate to whose posts are you sharing. And this, of course, is related to the whole idea of the accusations of fake news and what is credible, and stories that get passed along, and dark posts that don't get recognized, and that type of thing. But then also psychometrical warfare, where they have data points about what you're specifically interested in or what triggers you. or what sets you off. And of course, Facebook then introduced things beyond just the sort of thumbs up like. They began to introduce a little bit wider range of emotional faces for you to then click, that would then give them data that ultimately is apparently ended up in a large scale ops, consciousness operations warfare outfit like Cambridge Analytica, where they have data points on the specific things that can trigger you in certain ways. And so I would call that the emanation of psychometrical warfare of some point, that's based on the metrics that you've provided for yourself. And then just finally, I would add that there's a fourth category of rhetoric that's usually forgotten about, and it's called kairos, which is it's a different type of time. Linear time or metrical time is considered in Greek philosophy as chronos. But kairos is the idea of context or the moment, and the literal definitions of it are very interesting, and people should go look it up. It has something to do like the moment where you have a chance to push it on through. So I would say that this fourth category of rhetoric opens up possibilities for us, where we understand our context, both in terms of history, but also in terms of social context, where there are possibilities that maybe we didn't think of before, and that are outside of these three well-worn, warfared categories of logos, ethos, and pathos, and looking for these openings for actions that maybe have not been considered before. And of course, this is also the idea of the realm of improvisation, and in the ancient rhetorical arts, really that was why you studied and set up memory palaces, so you could know your arguments, and you could know all of your grammar, logic, and rhetorical devices. But then the best rhetoricians were those that recognize opportunities in the moment, like the best jazz musician or even classical musician who was riffing on a certain mode.
Yeah. Now, I guess I can see some of this played out in current events. Like I think this current moral panic regarding Hollywood and Harvey Weinstein is there's a reason why now all of a sudden the casting couch is a concern, and you've this pattern of various people, various celebrities, men in the media being called out for this, when this has been going on ever since Hollywood was around. Why is it now an issue? A certain meme is being created, a certain manipulation, I think, of the mass mind is being perpetrated here. And could that be an example of sort of this con ops, where these data points have been examined, and now, for whatever reason, there's a confluence of events, or there's some interest, perhaps there's a purge going on in Hollywood or something, and this meme is being thrown out there to achieve that objective?
Good question.
It's definitely a good possibility, and before answering that, I feel like I went a little far afield in terms of your original previous question about Israeli technology and backdoors, and of course this plays in also to this moment of some of the revelations around Harvey Weinstein that are not so front and center, but are more front and center than we've seen before in a certain way. In terms of this article in the New Yorker by Ronan Farrow, where it disclosed that Harvey Weinstein was using a black cube, which is made up of veteran Israeli intelligence agents and officers, I would imagine, and to go ahead and try to keep his criminality under wraps. And that also then flowed into, he was using Kroll, which if Black Cube is sort of like Tel Aviv centric, Kroll is New York centric, with strong ties back to Tel Aviv and probably back to the city of London, and also British special forces. And Kroll is a key character, of course, in September 11th. They were the human intelligence security so-called for the World Trade Center. They were brought in apparently after the first World Trade Center bombing that had the certain facts on the ground that put that deep into the heart of certain elements of FBI connected with certain Zionist elements, including people like Michael Cherkasky, who ended up at Kroll eventually, and so that is I think a key piece of some of what has been exposed in this Harvey Weinstein scenario. But then, of course, there's a lot being hidden in a way too at the very same time. And Harvey Weinstein at his at the Cannes Film Festival would co-host parties with what's he's termed as the wealthiest man in Britain, and he's actually Soviet. He's was born in the Soviet Union, Sir Leonard Blavatnik, who is a major player industrially worldwide in Russia, but also in London and increasingly in the United States of America, and is taking over large portions of entertainment companies, including parts of what was Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary's former conglomerate. I believe he sort of let go of his position there. The Dune Rat Pack. And of course, Rat is short for Brett Ratner, who's another individual who's been outed as a sexual predator of sorts. And I believe he was also the producer of the Wonder Woman movie that stars a former IDF member, Gal Gadot. And yes, even she was sort of forced to distance herself from Brett Ratner. But I do think that at the same time as there is some exposure of Hollywood in terms of the casting couch and as sexual predation and sexual domination as a key piece of it. And of course, there is a very strong reckoning that the Jewish community should be doing right now in relationship to this, and in large part has avoided and tried to tamp down the obvious aspect that there is a lot of there's a predominance of Jewish men who are being accused of these things, and so there's something there. And at the same time, I do think that you are probably correct in that there's a way that it's being framed. First of all, it's definitely trying to cover up the deep aspect of pedophilia, and the use of child sex slavery and the blackmail part of it is definitely being covered up. And also there is an aspect where it seems that there's parts of it that are attempting to maybe split or put into question some of the what we might want to see is more the healthy sexual dynamics between men and women. Mm-hmm. And of course, some of that I do think should be looked at and questioned. And it is clear that women in large part have been the largest set of victims in relationship to this Hollywood sector. But of course, this is rampant. This is endemic to all the major industries of our modern society. The sexual domination and sexual blackmail, and sexual blackmail, of course, is where the rubber meets the road in terms of our politics.
And that's something that the Mossad excels in too, right?
Yes, very much so. That's true. Even thinking of the idea of skull and bones and the ritual that both John Kerry and George Bush allegedly took part in, where you're lying in the coffin and you're exposing your background. It's similar to mob ties of where if you know that somebody's done a crime together or murder together, then you have something on each other.
I believe George H.W. Bush had one of those names. He was it Gog or Magog? Was that his nickname in Skull and Bones?
Yeah, I think he was Magog.
Yeah, and that fits into all this old biblical prophecy prophecy and all that. So I don't know exactly what. It's pretty occult sounding, especially when you consider. And the thing is, you mentioned Skull and Bones, and of course Bush is at the George H.W. Bush. There have been all sorts of allegations about him. The thing is, all these people are surprised because Bush seems like such a genial, harmless old man sitting there, in his walker or whatever at the Super Bowl or wherever he's at. He's just the kindly old man who does all these great benevolent philanthropic projects with his Masonic 1,000 Points of Light organization. He's a great hero, but if you really study history and you really look at a lot of what's been going on with these rings in D.C. with child trafficking and all this, it's not the least bit shocking that George Bush is acting as a predator. And matter of fact, his worst crimes are still being completely covered up, while some of these things that he's been alleged to have done to young women are in the news. But it's still keeping complete wraps on many of the absolute heinous crimes that he appears to have been involved in.
Yeah, it gets us back to the Franklin scandal.
Sex-wise.
Yeah, and the whole thing of the Franklin scandal and the role that blackmail and human trafficking, pedophilia play in the political process. For Pete's sake, we had a former Speaker of the House exposed as a pedophile, and no one thinks there's any wider implications to that. He didn't become Speaker of the House despite the fact being a pedophile. He became Speaker of the House because he was a pedophile. That's how the system works. That's how. If you want to understand how politics works and the role that sex plays in politics, that is the best understanding. If you look at the career of Roy Cohn, who was the expert in human compromise, and he was known as being a great lawyer. It wasn't because of his legal acumen; it's because he had all the goods and all the judges.
Right. Just tell me which judge it is. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I was thinking when you said that Dennis Hastert, it wasn't despite being a pedophile that he was the head of the House. It was because of it. Maybe similarly, we might, suppose or wonder whether it wasn't in spite of being connected to Mossad blackmailer Jeffrey Epstein, tied back into people like Ehud Barak and even British royalty, that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were the two candidates we were allowed to vote for. It was maybe because of their closeness to Jeffrey Epstein's Mossad blackmail operation.
And speaking of that, Tim, you mentioned Roy Cohn, and it turns out that Roy Cohn was the personal mentor not just of Donald Trump, but also of a man named Roger Stone. And it's interesting with
Roger Stone.
Roger Stone's been the person who has been, Roger Stone was the person who came out that we're supposed to take his word as gospel. And I don't know. I don't know what Trump has or has not done in association with Jeffrey Epstein. But it was Roger Stone who's the person who says that Donald Trump never took any trips on this. He took one trip and he was sick and then he left and he never ever went to any of these flights, whereas the Clintons were on there multiple times. But you got to look at somebody like Roger Stone and what he represents. Roger Stone is notorious for living what he calls a libertine swinger lifestyle, first of all, and he was involved in certain activities that caused him to resign from Bob Dole's presidential campaign back in '96. And he's had this. Not only that, but he's also been connected to Roy Cohn. It does look like Roger Stone may very well have been connected to this Franklin scandal and a lot of the what was going on with the Republican Party in the 80s with regards to D.C. and a lot of these rings that are going on. So I would ask people, why in the world would you believe a word Roger Stone says about this?
Well, because, Greg, Trump can only potentially have procured Epstein's underage sex slaves in the Lolita Express in the air or on an island, not in the Mar-a-Lago Country Club or a Manhattan brownstone. Don't you know that?
Of course not. And Roger Stone was involved in. It appears Roger Stone, according to a Wayne Madsen article, which is actually published on InfoWars of all places, considering Roger Stone is Alex Jones's best friend now. Back in 2008, connecting Roger Stone to the efforts to the two Israeli-linked efforts, it appears, to hurt Elliot Spitzer when he was removed as governor of New York. So
yeah, and I guess that's the example of a fellow tribesman being expendable, right? Because Elliot Spitzer was getting close to the financial shenanigans, I guess.
Yes, he wouldn't touch 9/11, but he was too close to the exploring the money shenanigans. So I guess that tribesman did have to be sacrificed like Harvey Weinstein.
Well, yeah, powerful. I mean, when we talk about Jewish power or the organized Jewish community, quite often it's the little Jews that get sacrificed all too often for the greater cause. But that's true in any. I mean, it's,
sure.
The little guy always gets screwed.
Always gets sacrificed. We encountered Greg. Greg observed this, witnesses this in relationship to me as a little Jew walking into a big Jew situation over at the Kansas City Public Library with lots of big donors, and for some reason, me being against the Jewish state's involvement in killing Jews in the World Trade Center on September 11th made me somehow an expendable little Jew, I guess.
Yeah, because there's the greater good, Jeremy.
There's the greater evil.
Yeah, the greater evil. Yeah, the Zionist project in general. It's
Yeah.
That's
Theodore
interesting.
Herzl said.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Because I was thinking about that idea of Churchill. Greg and I were talking about this. Churchill's a book or article about the Jewish choice between collectivism and Bolshevism and Zionism and sort of authentic Jewish state in a way. And what you were just talking about, Tim, the idea of Zionism is turned very much into an intensely collectivist project where the Jewish state is willing to not only sacrifice millions of Semitic Muslim lives around the world. If you listen to someone like the Australian thinker Gideon Polea, also thousands of American and Jewish and hundreds of Jewish lives in the trade tower on September 11th. So in a certain way, you can see that as a sacrifice to the collective, and in a certain way, you could see it also as an icon or as a golden calf in a certain way.
And another example might be one Leon Klinghoffer, according to Ari Ben Menashe, in his book Prophets of War, where that whole Achille Lauro thing was a Mossad operation. So
and they pushed his wheelchair off of the boat, right?
Mm-hmm. But they were bribed to go do something awful. I mean, if you think of who benefits from these horrible terrorist acts, it wasn't the Palestinian cause that benefited from that. It made it look awful. Obviously, it doesn't take you don't have to be too clever to figure out who's really behind it. This gets in that whole original discussion about gangs and counter gangs and controlled opposition. Obviously, this goes back into false flag terrorism, and subsequently in the years after, there's been a lot of great research about this whole idea of false flag terrorism and these controlled oppositions or counter gangs. Obviously, if you talk about to the extent that Al Qaeda existed, it was a CIA operation. You have Hamas was created by Shin Bet, I believe, right? If I have that right, correct?
Israeli intelligence.
Yeah.
Yes, and what's interesting too is that I believe Shin Bet actually has an internal operations that specifically focuses on imitating Arabs, and I believe their name is Yamas. So I don't know if that's a coincidence or not.
And of course, historically, I think the King David bombing, the King David Hotel bombing in 1947 was really attempted to be blamed on Arabs, if I have that correct. You have the Lavon affair. And who knows who they're going to blame the Liberty on if they hadn't gotten caught.
Yeah, maybe Egypt.
Egypt, yeah, you don't know about that. And, of course, the questions regarding 9/11 and the connections that people have done with at least the Israeli dimension to 9/11. You've had the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which has become sort of this. This is the Kushners, which this is the son-in-law of the President of the United States now. This criminal Zionist family, really sordid story there. It's really entertaining how they tried to set up his brother-in-law as a prostitute and these things. But they've turned the Port Authority into sort of this little Zionist criminal cabal where they profit off of real estate speculation and all types of smuggling and anything. So,
and now with Kushner, it turns out that this big old controversy over Michael Flynn and the collusion with Russia, turns out, it appears, at least in the news that's just come out, it appears to have been about Israel and not about Russia. Well, it is about Russia.
It was about managing the relationship with Russia for Israel.
Okay.
And the Kush, you're right. The the elder Kushner generation of the sexual blackmail was even between brothers. I mean, I wonder if that's extended to the Jared and his brother.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and you're right, though. This Port Authority is a major complex in relationship to understanding what actually happened on September 11th.
That gets like Lucky Larry Silverstein, who apparently used to talk every week to Netanyahu.
Correct. I think there was an article Up in Ashes or something like that disclosed that they talked on the phone every Sunday for years up through September 11th.
Yeah. Yep. It was a horrific.
And then also Larry Silverstein's friends, Frank Lowy, who I believe was a former goon, I believe similar to Rahm Emanuel's dad, was he's the Australian billionaire who started the Westfield Mall, and you remember the Israeli intelligence complex that was surrounding September 11th, both physically and time-wise. And a year on both sides of September 11th, there were hundreds of Israeli spies rolled up. And one of those complexes that included things such as the art students that were following the patsies all around the country, or sort of probably protecting them or even imitating them in the case of Muhammad Atta, who one of them spoke Hebrew, in fact, but also the idea of the urban moving systems. Dominic Suter, which was very much implicated in what happened on the morning of September 11th, and not only in New Jersey, but apparently on George Washington Bridge. Even Dan Rather reported on white vans with explosives being caught on the George Washington Bridge. That was urban moving system. So that was the moving trucks. Also, these rings of I think it was called Zoom copters, and they worked in the malls.
Yeah.
So you can imagine too that the Frank Lowy and this Westfield Mall situation is actually in some way an intelligence operation, and I believe that it was in. There was a mall bombing. It was at a Westfield Mall complex. Now, it's not conclusive, but it's suggestive. Then there was also the Ronald Lauder, right, Greg, who was also a key relationship to this network of transferring the real estate to Larry Silverstein in a month and a half before it was blown into smithereens on live television with living human beings in them.
Yeah, Ronald Lauder, I believe, I'd have to double check this, I believe he was a key player in privatization at the New York, New Jersey Port Authority around the time of September 11th. And Ronald Lauder now has gone on to be the head of the World Jewish Congress. And Ronald Lauder's probably been the foremost leader of a global Jewish organization that has been defensive of Donald Trump. When all these other Jewish leaders were calling Donald Trump and Steve Bannon anti-Semites and saying they're bad for Jews, it was Ronald Lauder who was going on television, making the media round, saying that Donald Trump is not an anti-Semite. He's a friend of the Jews. And by the way, Trump and Lauder, I believe, both graduated the same year from Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania, I believe. And so this is another long-term connection that Donald Trump has with prominent Zionists. And it was ironic that Trump got all of this backlash for not making a statement or for not specifically mentioning Jews during the global Holocaust Remembrance Day. But on Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day, Trump spoke at I believe it was to the World Jewish Congress with his good friend, as he mentioned him during his speech, Ronald Lauder, in attendance, where he specifically talked about Jewish suffering during World War II. So I found that really interesting. I would say one thing to be cautious of with Jared Kushner is that obviously Jared Kushner is a very troublesome individual, and he definitely has a lot of sway over what's going on in the Trump administration now. It appears that Kushner is leading this effort in Saudi Arabia with this Mohammed bin Salman, who is bringing Saudi Arabia closer to Israel and kind of, it appears to be in some ways, perhaps tightening the noose around Iran as far as bringing the Arab countries into an alliance with Israel and the U.S., of course, in terms of increasing the pressure on Iran. But I would advise with Kushner that in a lot of ways, I think Kushner in some ways is used as a boogeyman to an extent, whereas all of the bad things Trump does, or anything that Trump does is bad, can just be blamed on Kushner. So it's like a lot of these alt-right people will just focus on Jared Kushner and say that Trump has to get rid of Jared Kushner and his influence over his family if he wants to do good. Meanwhile, you've got all these other nefarious individuals that have all this influence over the Trump administration, from David Horowitz to Ronald Lauder to Steve Bannon to Alan Dershowitz, Steve Bannon and the Breitbart crew, and you completely ignore all of these people, and so you can still portray Trump as just being the good man who just wants to make America great again and bring America back to where it once was and solve the immigration problem and all this and that. Meanwhile, if you just focus on Kushner, and you can just portray him as kind of a George Soros type within the Trump administration, he's the evil globalist Jew who's just out to undermine everything Trump does. You take all this attention away from all of these other people, and I think that actually benefits Trump administration. It benefits the Zionist agenda that you've got all of these alt-right people just portraying Jared Kushner to be the epitome of everything that is wrong with Trump. And if you simply just got him out of his ear, everything would be okay when you're ignoring all these other people.
And also, I think one thing that the Trump presidency has done, I think, Jeremy, you mentioned this, either you or Greg, I'm not sure, how, after 2008 with the Ron Paul campaign, which was sort of a limited hangout to begin with, it was probably co-opted, and there really was, he really was denied victory in Iowa and these things. There were really shenanigans going on to blunt his campaign. To what extent that, that every chance of succeeding, the GOP made sure he wasn't going to get what he deserved. But the idea that you had some real trenchant criticism of institutions, structural problems like the Federal Reserve System, the banking system, this evil Judeo-Masonic banking system that we all suffer under, and these things. And there were some real questions being asked. Although something like 9/11, these things, the libertarian community generally shied away from that. Outfits like antiwar.com and these things, the blowback narrative that they seem to cling to. But nevertheless, there was some real criticism. And now we're back to this game, sort of a game of personalities again, where it's just a question of a man on a white horse, a good guy getting our guy getting inside and doing the right thing, and which is part of the game, don't you think? Part of the trick.
It definitely, and it does look like that in many ways. And yes, with Ron Paul, there was actually a from the right principled libertarian perspective, a serious critique of the control structures, including the financial ones that you mentioned. And yes, there was a limited hangout that very much showed itself in relationship to the war on terror, false flag terrorism, September 11th. In a certain way, maybe Ron Paul was like the Dennis Kucinich from the left, or maybe even like the Bernie Sanders of the left in a certain way, where he didn't protest in a serious, open fashion when the primaries were openly stolen from him. And in fact, I've dug into some of the statistical analysis of the 2012 primaries, and it looks like there was actually very clearly machine hacking that was done in relationship to larger voting precincts.
Was it the Russians? No.
No, but it might have been the Department of Homeland Security, which is tied into the global Zionist matrix, which has strong footholds in Russia. Mm-hmm. But I don't think so. In that case, I think it was much more domestic. It was tied into very specific voting machines manufacturers that were actually located up, I believe, in Nebraska even, or something like that. And they very much appeared to favor the insider Mitt Romney over Ron Paul. And Ron Paul was the dog that didn't bark. But yes, at the same time, he was a principled, he anti-war. He had a very strong approach to it's been called non-interventionism, but he's a doctor, so it actually should be called a do no harm foreign policy. And so that was a very there was a principled approach that represented a realness, yes, with some limited hangout, but a realness of a right perspective. And then the man on the white horse and Trump, where it's not clear he actually has a critical structural philosophy of some sort. He's more of a deal maker. He works through his sense of loyalty in a way, and not loyalty to certain principles, but loyalty to people, that type of thing, And at the same time, I don't know. It is possible that there is an outside Donald Trump and an inside Donald Trump, but I don't do faith-based politics. I do politics based on facts. I'm open to possibilities, but at some point I need to see, things start to happen. This thing with Flynn, in a certain way, which relates back to Kushner, there are some interesting things beginning to possibly pop up. And a lot, I believe, will be revealed in terms of who else is going to be exposed and how close or all the way to Trump does this go. Of this is very interesting, that this very short legal document that Flynn signed off on in terms of guilty was touched on this relationship to trying to interfere in a UN vote about illegal Israeli settlements. Mm-hmm. And very quickly people were saying this, well, the only sort of the major senior Trump official who Flynn would have been answering to was Kushner. Now it looks like that potentially Kushner might have been out of town at this infamous Mar-a-Lago meeting, and it was actually Donald Trump Jr. who might have been the one. But no matter, a lot of them are in the fold here, and I believe certain people might end up going down. And there are some questions about it looks like there are a lot of indictments, sealed indictments, thousands of them around the country that are way out of the ordinary in terms of the normal legal year. So what that means, and whether that there is some aspect of some type of swamp draining that is potentially promised by all of that, I don't know. I'm not going to pray to that kind of icon or that type of idol, but I'm open to the possibilities of a larger moment. And in a certain way, I think this brings up the problem of the idea of politics of iconography and of the man or woman on the white horseback, rather than a politics of we the people. And that doesn't mean there's no leaders. It just means that we are all responsible for thinking our way through what we want our political future to look like and why, rather than once every 2 or 4 years going and touching the touchscreen of some black box voting machine or that type of thing.
Yeah, and hoping that it registers the vote properly.
Yes, yeah. And more so, like with this problem of the Israeli backdoors, we've always had our own domestic problem in terms of CIA and NSA compromise and these kind of operations from internal, but even all the way back to the Federal Reserve Bank, which was pretty clearly not an indigenous American phenomena of any sort, but definitely through more and more, I'm realizing that the assassinations of the 60s were not only domestic black operations, but there were very much Israeli elements to a lot of those, including the assassinations of the Kennedys, and more so looking like the assassination of King, and similar type of mob axes that go from places like New Orleans up to Montreal or Toronto, and Bronfmans and Permindex and these types of connections. But yes, more and more we have to be on the alert for the increasing Israelification of our politics and our technology. And that would include things like voting machines. But as you already pointed out, Amdocs, which I believe was back in the turn of the century, was already handling virtually all of the billing of the telephonic records in the United States of America, which also tied into some of these Israeli intelligence networks and some of these art student spy rings that are exposed in the DEA. It's about a 60-page report that people can go look at, where Israeli Israeli intelligence posing as art students were going to the homes of DEA, justice officials, prosecutors, that type of thing. And in combination with something like backdoor telephonic technology, such as Amdocs or Verint or NICE systems, these types of things, you have a very potent mixture to be able for a hostile foreign intelligence apparatus to be able to undermine, the good faith, loyal investigations of American officials potentially.
Yeah, and of course you're going to have someone like Michael Chertoff at the Justice Department quashing any investigation. It helps too.
Yeah, there's a very interesting angle that I think that has a lot to do with this question of Russian collusion and whether or not Russia actively interfered in the American elections or not. And I think with this whole case of Michael Flynn and this attempt to sway Russia's vote within the UN on the resolution to condemn Israeli settlements or not to condemn Israeli settlements, it appears that when you keep seeing these connections, these Trump, quote, Russian connections, it appears you continually see these patterns pop up, which seem to point to Israel rather than Russia, whether it's Michael Flynn in the UN vote or whether it's a figure like Felix Sate or some of these other, quote, Russian oligarchs, which certainly have close ties to the Jewish establishment in Russia, particularly elements within, say, the Chabad Lubavitch and the Orthodox Jewish community that are also closely connected to a lot of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Just appears that these connections they just keep on piling up, and just continually, every time you really look at these Russian connections that keep popping up in the media, you can really start digging and find that these are at least as much Israeli as they are Russian. And I think this makes a lot of people uncomfortable within the alternative media. And I'm not trying to say Vladimir Putin is this or that, but I think this does make a lot of people uncomfortable within the alternative media who have been who really have this strong hardline belief that Vladimir Putin is a force of good for good in the world, and that, he saved Syria and he's doing this and that, and he's pushing back against a lot of the neoliberal Western globalization that's going on. But I think that has to be very seriously questioned, because what is the one power that could collude with an election and get away with it? It is Israel. Mm-hmm. And there are these connections between Russia and Israel that keep popping up with relation to Donald Trump. And I think it's really time to start raising tough questions about these and start raising these questions to people, because it's interesting. You can have somebody like Oliver Stone, who was the subject, who did direct Arnon Milchan's JFK film, go on Stephen Colbert's program on CBS and say that Israel extends far more influence over American connections than Russia does. But if you were to take the next step and actually ask the question, is Russian collusion, could it actually be Israeli collusion? These people won't do that. So I'm not saying one way or the other don't let me influence your opinion on, say, Putin or somebody like that. I'm not trying to make a definitive case on it, because I don't know what the truth is about Russia and about Vladimir Putin. But these are connections. These are things that need to be addressed by honest people with and good conscience. Yeah, I mean, you make a good point, because the Israeli connection, the Zionist connection, the organized Jewish community and its various organizations, whether it's B'nai B'rith ADL or its various intelligence operations, which actually spread into corporate America and the government and these things. There's a transnational relationship here, or a connection that transcends nation states or nationhood. This goes to the essential question regarding, the diaspora and the notion of an Israeli state and all Jews being loyal to that state. Raises questions about loyalty. I think legitimate questions, and the one shouldn't be labeled anti-Semite or bigoted for raising this question. I think Phil Giraldi raised, of all people, Giraldi, who's this kind of hard-nosed, realist, a foreign policy analyst, came out and said this, that whenever you're hearing someone talk about something regarding Israel, whether it's Palestine or
or espionage the United States, you have to ask the question: if this person is Jewish, or does he have divided loyalty? I think it's a fair question. Do you agree?
Yes, and I've come up with the concepts of the deep Jewish state, which very much is directly connected to the Jewish state, Israel, and its intelligence operations and that type of thing. But there's also the idea of the Jewish deep state, which is much more global, has to do with organized Jewish power worldwide. And then, of course, there is the interplay in relationship to between the deep Jewish state and the Jewish deep state. And even someone like Tom Cotton, who is being floated, I think, maybe potentially in an unrealistic fashion by Bill Kristol to be the head of the CIA to replace Pompeo. Even Tom Cotton openly acknowledged the benefit that he believed that the U.S. intelligence, not just from on the ground human intelligence Israel in the Middle East, but he very specifically spoke about this problem of Zionism, of the helpers, of Jewish helpers in all around the world. Probably just upper middle class professionals are willing to rent a safe house for Mossad operations, but the higher level of that in terms of not just the deep Jewish state Mossad operations, organized oligarchical Jewish power operations, are things like people in key positions in terms of whole sectors, such as media, such as finance, such as academics, such as politics, such as non-profits, such as the so-called Anti-Defamation League. So clearly it does bring up the issues of loyalty and dual loyalty. And it does look more and more like the especially in the United States of America, in terms of some of the Jewish people in the United States of America, who many, if not most, are at their heart, I believe, are accustomed and believe in the Bill of Rights and American traditions having to do with things like free speech and aspect like that Greg and I really did bump up against very, very severely at the library. It was pretty tense to see the ways that in some of the comment sections about the arrest of the librarian and me at the library in the Israeli press, the comments tended to be more like, "Oh, you deserved what you got talking to me," or "If I were there, it would have been worse." In American comment sections, including people who had Jewish names or identified as Jews, they were almost completely, even if they would say, "Well, I think he's an asshole," or "He's a conspiracy nut," state-sponsored terrorism in the United States. I still think the idea of using violent state power and security forces against speech and press is really a place that I don't want to go. And it's pretty clearly opening up in a certain, especially with long-term Netanyahu and more and more siding with sort of hard, more and more actually Russian right, sort of sometimes secular, sometimes orthodox politically in again, liberal Jewish sentiment in terms of whether it's gender relations or issues of human rights or these types of things. So more and more loops back into this relationship with Russia, and that part of this move to this sort of hard, sort of authoritarian right politically in Israel has been based somewhat on a population transfer of hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million Russians, most of them Jews, but not all apparently, in the post-Soviet Union to Israel, including someone like the foreign minister. What's his name again?
Avigdor Lieberman.
Avigdor Lieberman, who has had a very close relationship with Putin over the years. And yes, the dynamics of the relationship between someone like Putin and Netanyahu, or Israel and Russia, is not clear. Of course, someone like Putin may be playing Israel, but he's definitely in a game with them of some sort. And more, there has been a turn in a way in Israel from being dependent on the United States of America, which of course has the implications of being dependent on the totality of American Jews. Towards other power sectors, including in China, which has a long relationship in terms of Shaul Eisenberg, or Russia, but also increasingly India. Oh, and then one last thing that just popped in mind in relationship to India that hints at the other things happening here than just this tendency towards the Israelification of global politics, including technology, is it looks like what might be classified as the Indian DARPA, the military technology division in India, has apparently lobbied very, very hard and successfully against Modi, who has this very strong relationship, sort of supplicant apparent relationship with Netanyahu in relationship to technology and trade and security and that type of thing. And Netanyahu brags about it to the global Jewish community, about moving Israeli security technology all around the world, including South Asia, but also But just recently, a big missile deal, I believe, that was going to transfer Israeli-made missiles to India was rejected and stopped. To me, that does point to possibilities that they're within all these power poles, including the United States, including Russia, including China, including India, especially I would imagine inside of aspects of the military, where you have something like oaths and national loyalty rather than sort of corporate sectors and civilian sectors where it's much more just sort of pay to play and being bought off and ultimate blackmail. That you would have elements that would resist the idea of turning over, especially military technology sovereignty, to a foreign power that is shown itself to be intensely manipulative and deceptive and play a key role in global terrorism.
Yes, yeah. It is interesting that when you talk about like defense contracting and security clearances, that the two countries, foreign countries that are able to compete for U.S. contracts are either British or Israeli outfits.
Yeah.
Which takes us back to the origins of Zionism, which is Lord Palmerston and the British Freemasons.
British Israelism, right?
Yeah. Interesting.
Which I think British was actually the root of Christian Zionism. I believe, it was back before Schofield, it was John Nelson Darby and the idea of British Israelism, and that so it all ties together and all appears to go back to these Masonic roots. But that's conspiracy theory. And I wanted to follow up Jeremy's comments about some of what Jeremy just said there, and me and Jeremy have come up with the concept of Israel first and Israel second neocons, and we've come up with this in relation to understand a lot of what's going on with Donald Trump, where you have so many of the hardcores in these hardcore, philophytic Zionists are behind Trump, but you've also got a lot of these neoconservatives who are proud members of the Never Trump movement. That would be people like Bill Kristol and David Frum and Robert Kagan, to name a few, Max Boot, to name a few. And what we've identified, or what we believe, theory we've come up with, is that there's Israel first neocons and there are Israel second neocons. Whereas I believe people like Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, David Frum are very much have a love and devotion to Israel. I believe that they are more in line with the American Western foreign policy establishment, which wants. Which at the end of the day still wants the American military might to be leading, global hegemony, and to be leading the global push for global power. And I think where this comes into conflict with Israel might be in the area of a lot of the more hardline right-wing sentiment in Israel, which includes the settler movement, just the building of unlimited settlements, and also desire this messianic view of Israel as of being the kingdom of where all world government operations, basically the key of global power will be in Israel, and perhaps this could be where Russia comes into play. But I think that the number one goal of a lot of these Bill Kristol types, where they fall in line with the neoliberal foreign policy establishment, is that perhaps they see Russia as their number one obstacle to American global hegemony, whereas perhaps Russia have more of a vested interest in, instead of allowing America to have global hegemony, in terms of if Russia wants to have more influence globally than America, that perhaps maybe it would be in their interest to forge alliances with Israel in the Middle East in some of these regards. And so I think that where you see this controversy is that, yeah, these guys are very much loyal to Israel, but I think that their loyalty to Israel only goes to a certain extent, and that therefore I think they're more in line with this overall objective of global hegemony, which the U.S. is at the center and the heart of it. And a big part of this, I think, is to try and perhaps rein in some of the more hard-line Israeli policies. And so I think that may be an area where there's some conflict with some of the more hardline obvious neocons who do support Trump, that are very supportive of him, and also support the more hardline messianic elements of Israeli policy. And I think there's also an element here too where a lot of these Bill Kristol types are less comfortable with the overt right-wing, some may call it fascistic nature of the Trump support base, which has all these domestic hardlines on issues like immigration, and are more to the left on issues like the culture wars. But I wanted to say real quick that at the end of the day, the 2,000-pound elephant in the room is Israel. And there were a couple of really good articles which came out regarding Ukraine and how Israel was silent, basically, about Russia's going into the acquisition of Crimea. And there were quotes from various individuals within the neoconservative establishment who said that, yes, there are these disagreements between the U.S. and Israel, but we're not going to make them public. And one of the major areas of disagreement was over policy having to do with Russia and Ukraine. So.
Mm-hmm. That's right, because you had Victoria Nuland there stirring up trouble, passing out cookies to the protesters, and probably paying for mercenaries to, perpetrate massacres, the Medan Square massacre, these things. But she, of course, she's a Jewish neoconservative. But what you're saying is that
Robert Kagan.
Robert Kagan, yeah, but there's that would represent sort of the pro-American or the more Americanist Zionist, as opposed to there's more.
Well, not pro-American in the sense of we can control the institutions to do our bidding. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, America. They want to use America as an instrument to achieve their objectives.
As the head of the global empire.
Yeah. One time there was the British Empire, then became the American Empire, and that is maybe a certain faction say, will maybe set their eyes east as the sun sets on the west, sort of. Yeah.
Right, so it was the Anglo-American Empire, and it's now become a Zio-American Empire, but the Zio part of it has begun to not want to depend so much, I believe, on the American part of that empire, and wants to be the head of the head nervous part of the nervous system of the global empire, and that would include technological operations, which is also why there is an intense move to what we might call DARPA 2.0. And the internet, the first generation of the internet was very U.S.-centric coming out of DARPA. And it's pretty clear there was hardware backdoors that the NSA probably owned for decades. And it looks like that in the maybe in the more social media-centric internet World Wide Web age, there is a DARPA 2.0 that Israel is trying to set up in more closer to Tel Aviv, and this includes their relations with all of these big companies. Intel, the chip manufacturer, their biggest chip manufacturing plant outside of maybe the U.S. I believe is in Israel. Microsoft has major relations, major centers. Facebook has probably its most major headquarters outside of the United States in Israel. Google is very much tied in. If you look at quantum supercomputing, there are two major quantum supercomputer centers, research centers in the United States, and at least one of them, the one I believe that's at USC, and I think it's a cross program between USC and Lockheed, is run by an Israeli engineer. And so then this goes back into this Talpiot program, which Talpiot was an innovation program that Israeli military intelligence introduced in the wake of some of their bigger losses in terms of the 73, I believe. And so what they decided to do was to full spectrum dominance. And in order to do that, they decided that they needed to dominate the technology center. And so what they did was set up a program where it's a combination of long-term engineering PhD programming types plus entrepreneurial skills, so you can build businesses, but then also trained in things like special forces, so straight up on-the-ground military operations. And it's very possible that people such as Ehud Barak and Benjamin Netanyahu, who were in Sayeret Metkal, which is an Israeli special operations unit. And I believe that Ehud Barak, who, by the way, not only was involved with Jeffrey Epstein, but was also the guy who introduced Harvey Weinstein to Black Cube, apparently. But Ehud Barak was Netanyahu's commander, I believe, in Sayeret Metkal. And in a certain way, you could see Netanyahu. I believe for sure Barak has a background in engineering, but I believe Netanyahu, when he was sent to the United States of America. So in a certain way, you can see him as like an American Talpiot agent, a long-term American Talpiot program of some sort. So he feels comfortable in American lingos and in customs. And then he goes. He also has very interesting close relation in terms of when he was living with his father. He lived very close to Condoleezza Rice in the United States, and there is some very interesting history in terms of Netanyahu. Very possible that things like the Talpiot program actually produced Israeli prime ministers, in addition to producing leaders, CEOs of the new internet sectors, or people in leading quantum computing sectors and that type of thing. And even then, thinking back to this idea, in addition to having a deep Jewish state, but you also have a Jewish deep state in terms of a global a Zionism network that has its own connections. Someone like Blavatnik. It was also a trained engineer, but then also was trained in starting companies, and now owns multiple companies. He's a major player, I believe, in Warner, or he owns Warner. And he's also now the major player who took the place of James Packard, the Australian billionaire, who was part of the Dune Pack company. And by the way, James Packard, Australian billionaire, is apparently a major. He's increasingly a major part of this investigation into Netanyahu's corruption. So we should keep an eye on that. So I guess I'm just saying that there is this idea that not only does the sort of the hard intelligence operations of the Jewish state that includes an actual operation like Talpiot that's driven out of their major technical university, Technion, which, by the way, has just created a New York campus with the help of Bloomberg in conjunction with Cornell. So that's pretty interesting. But also that there is this global network of the diaspora of Jewish power and people who are ultimately loyal to the Jewish oligarchy and the Jewish state that also have a certain background and history of being trained as engineers and then starting businesses and then playing a role in politics in many ways. That's
a very interesting point. Because the key thing is there is consciousness. I mean, these people would have a Jewish consciousness that they are part of a system, whether formal or informal. You take like the C&E network. A good example might be a Matilda Krum or Monica Lewinsky, all serving different functions. But the key thing is they would go in, they'd start careers, and they'd in the process networking, and there's a lot of, I guess you could say, ethnic nepotism here, so they can promote each other. And since they're ascending to or seizing important positions within corporate America, high-tech firms, and whether it's not Netanyahu selling furniture in the 70s in New York or Philadelphia, wherever he was, or someone selling software or making movies, making crummy Hollywood movies. While they're doing all that, they never stop being agents of Israel. They are people of the diaspora, and they all, while they're dispersed, they all belong to the state of Israel. And at one point or another, they're going to function in service of that state, in service of the Zionist interest. So this network has been created, nurtured, and developed through several decades. And so now it's almost automatic now, because their consciousness and their identity is such that they all work for this mission. And it doesn't come. I mean, you explained the way you did. Some people would think, well, that's just a crazy conspiracy. Well, this is how it's organized, right? I mean, this is the whole notion of the diaspora, right? Isn't this how it's run? The thought how we all go through this, the four corners of the world, we're dispersed. But we're still consciously we're Jewish. And after 1948 we became Israelis, and despite the fact that you're an American movie producer, you're still smuggling nuclear triggers for Israel, and never being called for it, never being held accountable for it.
Yes, and even just like thinking from being Jewish, and it was interesting. And when we got some discovery in relationship to when I was defending myself from these charges against me, and there was a lot of questions around my Jewishness. Mm-hmm. So there is this idea of that, because I identified myself as a Jewish American in my question, and I also referenced the Jewish Marine Alan Sobrowski. Inside, it was clear that there was, inside the Jewish community in the area, there was questioning of whether I was really Jewish. And I even saw the phrase of what this guy who says he's American Jewish, a Jewish American. So in a way that me describing sort of being Jewish, part ethnically, part culturally, part spiritually, family, that type of thing, that there was a question of, well, are you a Jew or are you not? What is this American part of your identity in a certain way? And that also clearly played out in terms of the idea of the values that I also believe are both American and Jewish, which have to do with a commitment to open dialogue. Mm-hmm. And yet there's this sort of monolithic power mentality of that everything, the means justify the ends justify the means, and that everything, including deception, including throwing out the Bill of Rights, including using violence in an unjust and aggressive fashion, is all justified if it's allegedly for the security of the self-proclaimed Jewish state. Mm-hmm. So yes, there is a sense of are you in or are you out in terms of being a Jew worldwide. And in this day and age, part of being a Jew worldwide is that you have to have a large amount of loyalty, if not a predominant amount of loyalty, to the Jewish state. And of course, Greg and I have analyzed. It was interesting this in the wake of things like Professor Anthony Hall up in Lethbridge being targeted by the B'nai B'rith with like a false flag Facebook post that was apparently generated by the Zionist alleged terrorist Joshua Goldberg, who was a troll who played a counter. He played the perfect counter gang troll on the internet. He played a neo-Nazi. He was Michael Slay being printed at the Daily Stormer for months on end. He also played Australian ISIS. He also played a radical feminist, and then he also apparently made this image along with this incendiary genocidal language in relationship to Jewish people, and it was put on Professor Anthony Hall's Facebook page and then removed and then used by the B'nai B'rith in Canada and spread all throughout the media in Canada and used to oust him unjustly and very likely unlawfully from his classroom. And he's been tenured for a quarter of a century. But in the wake of that and the arrests at the library, we were noticing that there was this uptick in the threats against the Jewish community centers all around the country and actually all around the world. And Netanyahu and Trump were getting together in the United States for the first time, and Netanyahu very clearly acknowledged that he was very close to Kushner, and even Netanyahu slept in Kushner's childhood bed when he went and visited their family, and but he did not acknowledge these major these bomb threats all throughout the country against Jewish community centers around the country. And then it turned out that these threats were coming out of southern Israel, and so it is interesting the way that the aspects of the Jewish community that are intensely loyal to this Zionist idea and to Jewish power as an ideal are willing to very directly threaten and terrorize Jews who are not apparently in the know, and who knows? We still don't know the extent of whether that was an intelligence operation. This guy Michael Kadar, who has been alleged to have made these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of threats all around the world, or whether this actually was some potential Israeli intelligence operation. He is apparently autistic. His parents claim he has a brain tumor, but the Unit 8200 in the other part of Israeli military intelligence has a division for autistic kids to get involved in things like signals intelligence and mapping intelligence. Like that.
That gets in that whole thing about autism and how the high-tech companies are now looking into recruiting autistic people for coding and things like that. Yeah, and that's. But I mean, you get in this whole day of basically the reality. There are such things as Jewish occulted or secret networks, secret societies, if you will, B'nai B'rith, Jewish Freemasonry. Alison Ware writes about this in Against Our Better Judgment with Louis Brandeis. There's this network that was very critical in getting the Balfour Declaration passed and ultimately U.S. recognition of Israel in the 1940s.
It was an organized Parushim, and I believe
that's known as it's a translation of the Pharisees, and it was Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter, both on the Supreme Court, who were part of this Jewish Zionist secret society while operating as Supreme Court justices, apparently.
And Alison Weir came under particularly nasty attacks from the progressive left Palestinian solidarity movement for, I believe, after this book was released, and I think it may have been because of those revelations.
Yeah, and also there's a book called State Secrets by Leon de Ponsens, and there's a chapter called the Landman document, and we're talking about Jewish state power before there was an official Jewish state, and this is regarding the Balfour Declaration and the British obligations in that promise, and there's a letter that was written to the British government, written by this guy Landman. This is before Israel exists as a state. This is the more or less the global Jewish community threatening the British Empire, which is at the time the preeminent power on the world. And in this letter, it was under these conditions that the Anglo-American Zionists published a threatening warning to the British government by means of the Landman document, addressing the British government as if they were speaking to an equal. They said, in effect, "You forget that you did not give us Palestine as an unsolicited gift," the Balfour Declaration. "It was handed over as a result of a secret bargain concluded between ourselves. We have scrupulously observed our part in bringing America into the war on your side. We call on you to fulfill your obligations in turn. You are aware of our power in the United States. Take care that you do not attract the hostility of Israel. Otherwise, you will come against grave international difficulties." So they're more or less reading the Riot Act to the British Empire, Jewish power. And this is 1917.
And even back into the 1800s, Greg and I did a show about the relationship of the B'nai B'rith to the Civil War.
Oh, yes.
And you see this rise of B'nai B'rith, which of course is a Judeo-Masonic secret society lodge. It's concomitant. It's probably related in the rise of Scottish Freemason. What's it called? Scottish Rite Freemasonry in the United States of America. And you see these key figures, people like Wolfe. What's Wolfe's first name?
Wolfe.
Simon Wolfe, who I found out also not only was a key player apparently in he met up with John Wilkes Booth in the morning before Booth shot Lincoln apparently, but he also played a key role in terms of certain maybe Confederate rat lines, that intelligence, that type of thing. But also, I found out at a conference about Jews in the Midwest that Simon Wolfe was a key figure in Ohio in these early peddler networks, sort of like a company town, like a Jewish company town. And so in a certain way, you could also imagine that'd be a very powerful, not only a corporate structure, so that the new immigrants, the new Jewish immigrants could be fit in. And of course, clearly if someone like Simon Wolfe is sort of a large player in this kind of corporate company town peddling structure, then there's probably a politics that also then moves on down the line just as surely as the Zionist ownership of media companies ensures a certain editorial line, and then apparently they also would bring carts of stuff, and then they would also talk to wives when the husbands weren't home. So there was probably some type of little sexual blackmail things potentially, or information gathering, and then they'd empty out their cart and put scraps on it and bring it back. And so there's a long, interesting history of how the sort of the corporate body of Jewish power is potentially organized in the United States, at least. And then thinking back, and I just was reading a book by the granddaughter of Abraham Zapruder, and talking about the history of the Zapruder film in relationship to the Kennedy assassination. And there's a stench there. And of course, in the middle of the book, this is pretty open, I guess, too, is that it was well known that Zapruder, Abraham Zapruder, was also a 32nd or 33rd degree Mason in his local lodge. So the coincidences begin to pile up in a certain way, and you can see an organization of power that was prior to a state apparatus. But when you then add on what we could call a garrison warfare state, that the sort of most hard line aspect that is not seeking any type of peace processes, even somebody as controlled as Kerry has begun to expose in his post-State Department days, that when you add that kind of garrison warfare state that's meant to be pursuing a greater Israel agenda, a clean break doctrine of transcending their enemies and not trading land for peace, then you get a very volatile combination of this previously organized global syndicate power structure with the fixed point of a state intelligence and long-term deep state technology sector.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. On the topic of the ADL, B'nai B'rith, and the Masonic foundations of it, William Cooper, the late Bill Cooper, did a 7-part series. It's on YouTube. I've listened to the first part of it, and I haven't listened to all of it. I've listened to the first hour or so of it. And I would, maybe for people who want more of an understanding, I would recommend that, like a 7-hour series, and it's available on YouTube. But really interestingly, with the ADL and the B'nai B'rith and the Civil War and the Confederacy, this element within Masonic-inspired element was very much supportive of the Confederacy during the Civil War, it appears. And there was also a very much within the Catholic establishment, the Jesuit wing of the Catholic establishment was very much opposed to Lincoln as well. And it's ironic, and this has been broken. Charles Giuliani on the Renegade Network's done some programs detailing the Jesuit opposition to Lincoln. But it's ironic how how an organization like the Ku Klux Klan, which had very much Masonic foundings with people like Albert Pike, turned into an organization that was so virulently anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic. There's a major irony there.
Yeah, also Andrew Pike is the only Confederate general statue in Washington D.C. It's not being, and no one's agitating to take it down.
Yeah, exactly. And then you fast forward. Yeah. Then you fast forward a century later, and it turns out it's a guy, David Duke, from the Masonic Ku Klux Klan, who's the face of hate in the world.
Yep. Yeah. Well, that's that dialectic and gangs and counter gangs, and
then you look at what these people won't talk about in relation to what they will and aren't willing to talk about either. In terms of,
I believe also what's interesting too is, in terms of these sort of power networks, these Judeo-Masonic power networks, I believe that they were also involved. So someone like Simon Wolf or Judah Benjamin or that type of thing, they were involved in ousting an abolitionist and pro-American Jewish rabbi from Baltimore named David Einhorn, and I believe he was ousted from his position. So there is a sense of that there is a necessity to make sure there is no opposition or authentic opposition internally in the Jewish community to these types of secret machinations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Maintain group solidarity through terror and intimidation. Yeah. And it's interesting regarding anti-Semitism in the South. We're talking ADL. ADL developed out of B'nai B'rith. And that was primarily created in reaction to the Leo Frank trial, and where this man was convicted of killing a young girl, Mary Fagan. And it was that time that the Jewish power targeted the South, and the South reacted. Up before then, there was anti-Semitism wasn't even known in the South. The South was actually, if anything, philo-Semitic. But it was Leo Frank was the local head of B'nai B'rith in Atlanta.
Yeah, and around the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, I believe a lot of the major businesses there, a lot of the major businesses in Montgomery were in fact Jewish owned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think they also, and so.
And the ADL's continued since its inception, really, in many ways, to be an enforcement arm, a public enforcement arm of speech, but also a covert intelligence arm, posing as a human rights organization. And that included into the 60s, where they were apparently spying on black leadership, including King, I believe, and but all the way into in the 80s, this ADL spying scandal, where they were caught using a contractor in relationship to a San Francisco police officer with a CIA background who had access to all kinds of records, personal records of tens of thousands of activists all around the country, including like Arab ex-senators who were starting credible Palestinian solidarity movements. Even the Pete McCloskey, the congressman from California, who's like a strong conservative. He was targeted by the ADL, and he actually was one of the people that led the way in the legal pushback to disclose that they'd been spying. And it was a West Coast axis that tied back into New York. And some of the disclosure actually shows that there might have been tension even within some of the message discipline and the enforcement of loyalty, even within some of the agreed upon sectors. There was a West Coast East Coast beef, I believe. Abraham Foxman was operating out of New York and was willing to sacrifice some of these upstart expendable West Coast LA and San Francisco youngin Zionists for exposing their key operations. And of course they were the Israelis were tied into it. Israeli intelligence was getting feeds out of this. There were activists that ended up dead. It was never proven whether they were or not. But also the front was in relationship to South African apartheid intelligence, right as there was an escalation of boycott, divestment, sanction movement in the 80s in the United States to put pressure on the apartheid South African government. And in many ways, I can see that the Israelis were not only getting immediate human intelligence on what they saw as their key nemesis in political organizing in the United States, but they were also seeing methods for trying to counteract what they knew was eventually going to come in terms of a boycott, divestment, sanction. And we're there now, where it's of Congress trying to shut down the First Amendment and make it basically illegal in some fashion to express First Amendment protected support for boycott, divestment, sanctions, or even here in Kansas, where a young Mennonite math teacher was disallowed from continuing her work with the state of Kansas and teaching people math because her Mennonite principles had led her to being part of the Solidarity for Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement. So it's coming to a head. That plus all the assault on free speech in terms of Brendan O'Connell in prison, Anthony Hall under renewed assault in the press by B'nai B'rith, and the many First Amendment issues in the United States. So things are coming to a head.
Yeah, this Israelization of American society, as you say. Yeah.
Well, there's both in a certain way. The power sectors, there's an Israelification, the escalation of Department of Homeland Security, fusion centers. Both of the two main guys who grabbed me and then ultimately arrested me were both came out of the local fusion center Department of Homeland Security. Both had been to Israel for training. Yeah. Both had been related to this what's been termed by the head of the Jewish Federation of North America as, quote, Jewish Homeland Security Secure Community Networks, which is basically a private or corporate security contracting organization. Both of them were related to that. At the same time, there's a Palestinification of America that's going on. I even said that when finally on-duty Kansas City police officers showed up when I was handcuffed and asking the off-duty officer what the charge was for speaking at a microphone, asking a former ambassador to Israel some quite factual questions. I said, this looks like the Palestinification of the United States of America. And what I think was an Italian-American cop and an African-American cop. The African-American cop clearly nodded his head And he had a sense, yeah, man. So this Palestinification of America, there's both the Israelification of our consciousness in terms of so-called security consciousness, using the threat of false flag terrorism or these hoaxed bomb threats straight out of Israel to Jewish community centers all around the country, or the ongoing, Gladio, sort of Israelified Gladio in Europe, apparently, and in the United States, probably too, in post 9/11. There is this Israelification going on at the same time as there's a Palestinification of our core American traditions and our basic natural rights.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that people's right to free speech, and people can be arrested and beaten up, and there's no accountability, no penalty for this type of obviously unconstitutional, illegal behavior. It speaks volumes. And you congressmen, senators actually sponsoring bills that were making it illegal to support the BDS movement. That's a complete violation of their oath of office. They're supposed to support the Constitution. Oh, well, whatever, yeah. but they do it so blatantly.
That's what George W. Bush said.
Yeah. Yeah, but you had this case down in Texas where that town had a hurricane relief. It was the town of the state was dispensing funds. I think parts they've been donated by people too, but hurricane relief aid. And under the conditions of accepting this relief aid, you have to promise not to support the BDS movement. And then, you have the picture of the Texas governor signing the law, and there's an Israeli flag behind him. And he's doing it, smiling.
Yeah, this is Greg Abbott, who's a great American patriot. If you listen to Alex Jones and all of them,
well, he wears a cowboy hat.
Exactly, just like his predecessor Rick Perry, right?
So he's got to be a great American to wear a cowboy hat. He's a good old boy.
Of course.
So. At the same time, I think that got rolled back because I think it got taken out, and I'm seeing also that there is maybe a pushback here. It's starting at the grassroots levels. It's definitely not yet become political or congressional.
Not the Congress, yeah.
Yeah.
But
if you think about this Mennonite teacher, she actually, the ACLU, which is a highly controlled organization,
yes,
I've noticed very close up. But they are actually supporting her in her legal actions against the state of Kansas around First Amendment. Mm-hmm. Professor Hall has actually been able, in over a long period of time, since over a year, he's been able to gather forces both from his local faculty association, but also the Canadian Academy. Or Canadian Association of University Teachers, which represents 68,000 Canadian academicians, have gone toe-to-toe illegally and won a battle just in the last week with the administration of Tony's University of Lethbridge, which bowed straight under pressure of the B'nai B'rith and other Jewish power organizations, and even not only yanked Tony out of the classroom, but then immediately suspended him, would not allow him on campus, took away his salary. Eventually his salary was brought back. But they also reported him to a human rights commission.
Yeah,
but that apparently is also not going to go anywhere. And Tony is back on campus, and they're actually going to have an academic hearing for what he's been accused of. The primary accusation is that he has alleged that Israelis and thus Jewish individuals. I saw the actual letter. This was a letter from the president. It said Israelis and thus Jewish individuals were involved in the September 11th attacks. And so that's now going to get an academic hearing. And I'd say in the first time in the North American Anglophonic Academy that should have taken this issue up about the truth and lies and the facts of September 11th. It clearly still matters. the weaponization of the mythology behind that event has led to the deaths of millions of human beings, the destruction of multiple nations, the loss of trillions of dollars of human wealth. And now Tony, because he didn't fold and go away and take a severance package, he's going to push it right into the heart of the Canadian Academy. And Professor James Tracy down in Florida has apparently just had a good a court hearing in relationship to him being fired for looking into false flags and operations such as Sandy Hook and other things. And I'm not giving up here in terms of a legal process. And so we do need to think about people like Brendan O'Connell, though, who is currently apparently in a dungeon of some sort in New Zealand and is not getting due process. And so I'd like for us to just try to raise some awareness about his situation so that he doesn't get left in a hole.
Mm-hmm. That's
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, definitely there's resistance and pushback, as there should be, as there would be, because it's been so brazen. And there'd have to be a reaction to it. As far as Congress goes, I think that's the question of Congress is it occupied territory or is it disputed territory at this point? I don't know.
It's definitely illegally settled, I'd say.
Yeah, illegally settled. Yeah. So, well, listen, Greg, Jeremy, I want to thank you for being on the show.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll do some editing. I know we had some communication problems, some connection problems, so I'll try to lump them all together and see if we can get a coherent show out of it all. So when I do, I'll probably post it in a day or so. When I do, I'll send you the link.
It's an experiment, so it's at least you get
I think most of
some experience with this whole process.
Yeah, so so that's the Antedote. What's the best place people can go to listen to this? That's YouTube still?
Yes.
Yeah.
For now. Yes, and in the future we are going to be diversifying into other realms, but right now it's just for now.
Yeah, and we have a page at No Lies Radio too.
Okay, great.
Yes, No Lies Radio.
Okay, that's Jeremy Rothe-Kushel and Greg McCarron for the Antedote. Listen to that. They have several shows up there. I've listened to a couple dozen myself, I think. Lost count.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, I think going back to, was it March, I think? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
So, yeah. So great.
Appreciate your work, Tim.
Yeah, I appreciate yours too. I highly recommend your podcast. It's you two go back and forth, and it's very informative. It's a unique perspective, an important perspective to get on these things. And so I do appreciate, people should appreciate your work. And I don't know if you get donations or not, but if you can, people should support it. So
we haven't set that up yet, but Greg and I are going to get together and try to take our game to the next level.
Yeah, try to do that. So pay for some of the time and some of the equipment you need to do this stuff. So listen, thanks a lot. I'll let you go, and we'll talk perhaps in the near future, when something else comes up.
All right.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, Tim.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.